Welcome, everyone. This webinar is called Better Dead Than Disabled, the Consequences of Extending Access to Medical Assistance in Dying, or MAiD, to Disabled People. We have almost 200 registrants today, so lots of people that I hope will be engaged in discussion in our second half. We've got disability activists, service providers, researchers, academic faculty and students, parents of disabled people, and more. And many of you identify as disabled. A particular welcome to folks from outside Canada. We've got people logging in from the US and the UK. My name is Dr. Margaret Oldfield. My name's Dr. Margaret Oldfield, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a white woman with chin-length gray and brown hair, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a red top and glasses. I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're on today. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. If you'd like to know more about the land where you live, check out native-land.ca. Few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and available later on the CSA's YouTube channel. Sherry Fox, Executive Director of the Canadian Sociological Association, will email you with a link to the posted recording. Sherry's also doing tech support today. Thanks so much for that. In the first hour of this webinar, panelists with lived experience of disability will describe the consequences of extending MAiD to disabled people not near death. In the second hour of our webinar, we want to hear your comments, stories, concerns, ideas for action and collaboration. Because there's so many of you, we've used the Zoom webinar format. You'll notice that there's no chat box on the screen and no raised hands icon, but you can use the Q&A box. And now for some technical tips. To turn on the closed captioning, move the cursor to the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window. Click on the closed captions icon. If you don't see it, click on the live transcripts icon. If you still don't see the closed captions icon, click on more. Then click on show captions. To enlarge the font of the captions, click on caption settings. You can also use the Q&A box to network, collaborate, share emails, share resources, links, and we'll share all of these messages with everyone after the webinar. We're recording them, we're keeping track. A brief backgrounder on MAiD in Canada. I'll start with some surprising numbers from Statistics Canada. Disabled people are Canada's largest minority group at 22%, and some say this estimate is too low, depends on how you define disability and what people self-report. Yet our issues and viewpoints are often ignored by politicians and policymakers. Track 1 of MAiD was legislated in 2016. At that time, only people with terminal illnesses who were near death qualified. Track 2 was enacted in 2021. This extended MAiD to people with medical conditions and disabilities who were not near death. That's what we're talking about today. To qualify, applicants have to have irremediable, intolerable suffering from a medical condition or disability. Note that MAiD was not extended to other marginalized groups, for example, those suffering from racism or transphobia. Applicants for MAiD must be approved by a MAiD assessor, generally a physician. Once they're approved for MAiD, the recipient must give approval again just before the injection or drug that kills them is given by their physician. MAiD is based on the medical view or model of disability. It totally misses the role of social context in disabled people's suffering, that is, the social model of disability. For example, discrimination in employment, poverty-level disability supports, being forced to live in segregated institutions for lack of community-based supportive housing, or for inadequate support being available, attendance support, for inadequate health care, home care, palliative care, among many other social factors. This social context reflects government's policy choices, but policies and programs can be changed. There are more tracks coming. On hold, it was supposed to be enacted last month, is MAiD's extension to anyone with a mental illness as the sole condition and to mature children. Also being discussed are advanced requests for MAiD in cases of dementia, other neurological conditions, which also may result in disability. So that's the end of my backgrounder. I'd like to dedicate this webinar to disabled Canadians who suffered from their social context and who were not near death, but nevertheless died by MAiD. I gathered these names from media stories and the Vulnerable Persons Secretariat website. The list includes only people reported by the media. It doesn't include disabled people who media interviewed who were considering or had applied for MAiD, but hadn't yet received it. And they had done so for reasons of poverty, lack of adequate health care, and living in institutions. There are many stories in the media of such situations, and people give these reasons as seeking death or seeking death beyond their physical or mental health situations. And likely more people have died whose deaths or applications for MAiD were not covered by the media. In total, in 2021, 221 people who were not near death died by MAiD. We don't know the numbers yet for 2022 or 2023. I'll give you a minute to reflect on these names. Our first speaker is Dr. Diane Dreger. She's an assistant professor in the interdisciplinary master's program in disability studies at the University of Manitoba. She's published 11 books. Her latest is Still Living the Edges, a Disabled Woman's Reader. She's been involved in the disability rights movement for 40 years and has worked with Disabled People's International, Council of Canadians with Disabilities, and the Disabled Women's Network Canada. For more information on Dr. Dreger, please see her bio on the CSA website. I'll leave you to describe yourself, Diane.
Okay, thank you so much, Margaret. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am a white woman with long blonde hair, and I am wearing glasses, and I have a rust-colored top. Today, I want to talk about the disability rights movement in Canada and MAiD. MAiD isn't a recent thing for the disability rights movement. We've been working on this for 30 years, trying to hold it back as a movement. And maybe folks don't know much about who we are as a disability rights movement, but after the Second World War, we had a lot of changes technologically that helped disabled people live longer and more quality lives. And disabled people started looking around and saying, hey, the environment is not built for us. Nothing is accessible for us physically. How are we going to make changes when doctors and social workers and our parents, in some cases, are telling us what to do? So people with disabilities got together into their own organizations in the early 70s in Canada and formed all across Canada provincial affiliates of people with various disabilities. They rejected the medical model, which Margaret mentioned, saying that the problem is with us as people with disabilities. We need to be fixed. We rejected that and said, no, we are going with a social model, saying society was not built for us. And we are citizens with disabilities, and we need to have equality like all other citizens in Canada. So our organizations were founded. We had founded an organization at the national level as well, which is now called the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. And in the early 1980s, we had a lot of victories. We got people with disabilities rights enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the new Constitution in 1982. We also got disability as a grounds for protection under the Canadian Human Rights Acts and the different provincial human rights acts. So we had presented ourselves as citizens with rights. In the early 1990s, something new started happening. All of a sudden, there were two cases which we worked a lot on. One was Robert Latimer. You may remember he's the father who murdered his disabled daughter, who I believe was 10 years old, and said that it was a mercy killing pretty much. And through that, a Council of Canadians with Disabilities intervened in the Latimer case to say, no, he should be tried for murder. This is not something that was done for the good of Tracy, his daughter, who did not have a say in whether she was living or not. And so through that, we found out that most Canadians agree that Robert Latimer was correct in murdering his daughter because he was being merciful. She was suffering, she was very disabled, and she didn't have a good life. So this, of course, was discouraging because we had established ourselves as citizens with rights that were going to be protected and are being protected. Secondly, Sue Rodriguez, a woman who had ALS from British Columbia, a person with disability, wanted to have assisted suicide, have a doctor assist her to take her own life. And again, disability rights movement, the organizations intervened saying, no, we don't want that because there is a slippery slope. We can see it coming. First, it's people who are terminally ill. Then it will go on to people with disabilities because they are not seen as valued in society. Well, that's exactly what has happened 30 years later. We were able to intervene in a number of cases over the last 30 years to hold back medical assistance in dying, as it's called now. And now we have Tier 2 saying that if you, as a person with disability or chronic illness, feel you are suffering too much, you can have a medically assisted death. Well, we find out that it takes less time to apply for MAiD as a person with disability, about 3 months, than it does to get to see a psychiatrist. So if you're a person who has mental health disabilities, you're on a waiting list. You're not seeing anybody for a year, but you can imagine, you hear, oh, only 3 months if I want to die. So unfortunately, there are people with disabilities who are choosing this option. And again, we as myself, as a person with disability who's been involved in this movement for 30 years, I simply can't stand by and have people choosing death over life. We need services. This is what we had established through our citizenship rights. We are supposed to be protected in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as vulnerable persons, and we are not being protected here. In fact, it is the opposite. So, and for myself personally, I'll just say there are several times in the last 30 years that I have been close to death myself with my chronic illnesses, and I am fighting to stay alive. And therefore, you know, I see it as all people with disabilities have valuable lives. The disabled life is worth living. And I would just like to read a short poem from Jim Dirksen, who was one of the individuals who worked on this issue as a person with disability for 30 years. And he recently died last year from natural causes. And I just want to read a poem that he wrote about this issue. It appeared in the Rhubarb Literary Magazine in 2016. In the Death Resistance by Jim Dirksen. I am not ashamed, have learned not to be, of my body being different in shape and function, large head and stomach, crooked fingers, thin arms and legs. I am not embarrassed to ask for help, to cut the meat on my plate, put on my clothes, wash my body, lift me in and out of bed, on and off the toilet, wipe my bum, all things I know I could no longer do. Is that the blood smell of death being stirred up by your offers of dignity and fear-proof, pain-free endings? I will not go away, and I will not die to reassure you, not to humor your illusions of how we are or should be, nor to satisfy your advertising images or your cold convenience. I will not die for your fantasies, you fearful, desperately unwilling learners. I will teach you the complex immensity of our so common true humanity. I am not afraid to invite my lovers to spoon or climb, to ride on top of me, naturally dancing to crescendo in our potent, most lovely actuality. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Diane, for your compelling presentation and showing us the power of poetry. Our next speaker is Dr. Gregor Wolbring. He's professor of community rehabilitation and disability studies at University of Calgary, a member of the Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis in Karlsruhe, Germany, and a fellow of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa. For more information on Dr. Wolbring's research interests, see his bio on the CSA website. I leave you to describe yourself, Gregor.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm just trying to move things around here with a different. And then we go to slideshow. And then we go. Okay, you should see everything, hopefully. Margaret, thanks for organizing it and CSA for hosting us. My talk is about disability burnout, ableism burnout. Before I go to my content, I want to thank my students. All my students are undergraduate students when they start with me, so bachelor, and many start with me right in year one. And I show quite a bit of data which comes from their work. Disability burnout. Let me use a phrase from Carol Gill, a disability studies scholar from Chicago. This term refers to emotional despair engendered by thwarted opportunities and blocked goals. It is aggravated and intensified by years of exposure to disability prejudice and devaluation. In fact, a frequently repeated theme in research interviews with persons with disabilities and illnesses is, I can live with my physical condition, but I'm tired of struggling against the way I'm treated. And I show a few examples of the disability privilege, prejudice, and devaluation. So I myself will not talk a lot about MAiD, if at all, but you can see this article is linked to the right to die. That's what it was written for. Case study, thalidomiders. That's a historic one. In the 60s, people were born with non-mainstream body morphologies when their mother took the drug thalidomide. Like I'm one of them, and I was born with shorter legs. Others had shorter arms, and so on. Throughout the 60s to today, there's of course a negative imagery related to thalidomiders. This is just from a book from 2001. Parents endured the shock of their thalidomide baby, collateral damage to their lives, special peculiar horror that the sight of their children produced in even the most compassionate, defining ordeal of their family life, leaving aside for now the crushing burden on their financial resources from now on. Now, beyond that, this is a negative imagery. It also blames the child for the financial resources which are used instead of the society for not supporting the family. Interestingly, there over time were a variety of academics who said that the thalidomide appearance changed the abortion debate. For example, Peter Singer, a philosopher from Australia, now Princeton, so not the Toronto one, in his book Rethinking Life and Death talked about that this changed the abortion law because it was moved away from a women's rights issue to have an utility far beyond women's rights. Case study, Canadian universities. This is a 2019 statistics from Statistics Canada about the reality of academic staff around unfair treatment, discrimination, and harassment. You see in yellow, 47% of disabled academic staff experience harassment and 35% unfair treatment or discrimination. That's the highest of all the groups, and it's more than double than if you don't report a disability. That, of course, is a factor in systemic disableism. This is systemic disableism. And no wonder, if that is the cost, if you do not have to disclose yourself, you don't. And indeed, you can see, right, on the faculty level, they're 6.7%. But obviously, the numbers are much higher, or we do a really bad job of hiring them. But if the cost of outing yourself is higher than the cost of masking, as in, right, putting up a front what you aren't, right, why would you do it? Bias coverage, including in research questions and studies. When you're getting pregnant at a later age, you have a higher probability to have a child with Down syndrome. That's a reality. That's a fact. But I said probability. But when you look at the literature, Google Scholar, it's linked to risk. It's seen as you have a higher risk of having a child with Down syndrome. And the risk, of course, is not a fact. Risk is a judgment. And if you use a risk language, then you simply preclude a positive imagery of the person because risk is something we want to get rid of. Transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Point 26, we are committed to the prevention and treatment of non-communicable diseases, including behavioral, developmental, and neurological disorders. To be clear, this would include Down syndrome, this would include neurodiverse people, and so on. But what I want to highlight is that in that sentence, they add, which constitute a major challenge for sustainable development. They do not putting that sentence anywhere else, like under that we have to improve well-being and that is a challenge for sustainable development. Question is why? When we're looking at the academic literature, newspapers, and Twitter tweets, how they cover artificial intelligence and machine learning in relation to disabled people, you find that the patient medical health angle is 20 times more covered than the social and disabled people with disabilities. It's purely techno-optimistic. We found no content covering negative effects of AI used by society on disabled people or the negative effect of autonomous AI on disabled people. Robotics The same thing, purely techno-optimistic. We found not one article that thematized a negative impact of robots on the employment situation of disabled people, despite the fact that there are buckets of papers who actually cover that in relation to non-disabled people. And we have even lists of which job goes first, right? Taken over by robots and automatization and so on. And that's also despite the fact that most of these easy, low-hanging fruits for robotics and automatization are the job disabled people are in, such as service workers, administrative support, sales workers, and so on. Invisibility, another thing which supports systemic disableism. This comes from the Kelly Foundation Vital Signs 2019, that did the same thing in 2012. We can feel threatened because of our difference. And then you see religion, ethnicity, skin color, culture, language, accent, gender, sexual orientation. Disabled people are missing. They were also missing from the 2012. And indeed, we don't, when I look through all of their yearly reports, you see little, actually nothing about the justice impact for disabled people and the equity situation. On March 24th, 2020, disability rights groups came up with a report of how to deal with COVID in relation to disabled people during the acute stage, but also thinking already about the aftermath. When I did the search for a blog piece I wrote in May 2020, looked at the English language newspapers in the Canadian Newsstream database, which is around 190, not one mentioned that report. April 7th, 2023, I just redid the search. Still, the report was never mentioned in the media. Youth environmental activism. We looked at 5,536 abstracts covering youth environmental activism. 0 covered children and youth with disabilities as environmental activists, and 0 the impact of environmental activism or environmental problems such as climate change on children or youth with disabilities. Interestingly, a couple of months later, there was an ABC News items which talked about disabled climate activist burnout because of the lack of representation, the lack of involvement, the barriers of being activist. EDI is the main policy framework in Canadian universities. DEI, it's in the US. Equality, diversity, inclusion is the UK. So we did in 2021 some searches around EDI policy frameworks, including dimension, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And frameworks we found around 1,011 abstract, 12 covered disabled people in universities. And we have now done another one, generic one, which just came out on EDI and what is actually covered. Conclusion. Given our push for evidence-based policies, this invisibility and the biased bad coverage are factors that strengthen systemic disableism, and with that further disability burnout, disableism burnout. And that includes, right, the lack of, EDI in the research questions covered within academia. A tool to audit content. I want to close with that. The bias-free framework was coined and set up by Margaret Eichler and Mary Ann Burke. The framework has 20 questions that indicate biases that help maintain social hierarchies in 3 main sections: maintaining an existing hierarchy, failing to examine differences, and using double standard. Now, both of them are open access, a short and a 300-page longer one, and you can use them literally for any content to see where the biases are. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Gregor, for your edifying presentation. Lots for us to think about there. Our next speaker is Dr. Nancy Hansen. She's director of the Interdisciplinary Master's Program in Disability Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's co-editor of the Routledge History of Disability and Untold Stories, a Canadian Disability history reader. Her latest article is Disappearing Disability, Disability Made Invisible. For more on Dr. Hansen's research interests, please see her biography on the CSA website where you registered. I'll leave it to you to describe yourself, Nancy.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you to the CSA, thank you to Margaret, and I'm very pleased to be on this panel. I am an upper middle-aged woman, white, with red hair and blue glasses, wearing a blue top. And I'm also a disabled woman on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I think, and I can't talk about this subject dispassionately. I'm a disabled woman in 2023 who is put in the position of having to justify her life under current legislation. So what I'm talking about is the choice trope, equity as a facade, or eugenics by any other name. There has been a tenfold increase in usage of MAiD since MAiD became law 6 years ago. And there's a strange form of irony here, because theoretically, we have more legislative protections than we've ever had as disabled people. The UN Convention is only the latest example. However, in the midst of all these protections, MAiD has been steadily advancing to the point where Canada now has among the world's most far-reaching application of medical assistance in dying. COVID-19 has brought into sharp focus just how tenuous and how tentative our legal positioning is. Legal protections for disabled people suddenly disappeared. You had to justify your access to medical care. Programs and services were cut back under the pretense of lack of resources, and many of those programs and services have not returned as restrictions are loosened. MAiD is being offered as a solution to poverty, lack of accessible housing, ramps, support services, and alternative. And as of March 2022, as an alternative to long-term prison sentences, 9 inmates thus far have been given MAiD. And this is more than the jurisdictions that actually have a death policy for crime. Just 1 second here. Is there a contempt for the disabled body? How comfortable are we really during the recent series of committee meetings reviewing MAiD? The head of the Quebec Medical Association advocated for MAiD being used for infants under the age of 1 that didn't meet the standard. So what do we do if we don't fit? It would seem to me that the stereotypes and antiquated ideas and thinking around disability are lingering just below the surface. And there's a comfort wrapped in science that justifies these outdated myths and misconceptions around disability. Just 1 second, I have lost my place. Talk amongst yourselves for a second here. Okay, here we are. The title of this panel, Better Dead Than Disabled. It would seem that society has yet to develop a comfort level with the presence of disability. Have we managed to truly address the social yuck factor, the messy the messiness of humankind, or has the safety net of science worked to justify the choice, but bolster and reinforce the outdated ideas that we have become so comfortable with, or mainstream society rather has become comfortable with? So is there really a choice here when there are few choices provided? It should be noted that disabled people were not eligible for CERB protections during the MAiD pandemic. And it was only after intensive advocating on the part of the disability constituency that disabled people were provided with a one-time MAiD, a one-time COVID allowance. It would seem that a lot of legislation around disability has been built around lack of expectation. There's a residual amount of eugenic thinking, again, just below the surface. The language of the legislation has been neutralized, but who is made more comfortable here? One of my colleagues in legal studies was called brave for wanting to explore the impact of MAiD in the disability community. So how far have we come really? And what comes next? All I know is that I do not want to be the first in line. Thank you.
Sorry for that technical glitch. We'll send you the link to Trudeau's presentation after the webinar. And I'll move on. So now we have lots of time for discussion. We've only gone 50 minutes through our time slot. And at the end of his webinar, Dr. Lemus said you could send him questions by email. We haven't yet got written permission from him, but if he gives us his written permission, we'll send you his email address as well after the webinar, and along with the link to his talk. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful presentations, and I hope that they helped you learn about and reflect on today's topic. As I mentioned, we've now got lots of time for discussion. We want to hear your comments and your stories and experiences and your concerns, and particularly your ideas for action and collaboration. You'll notice there's no chat box on the screen or raise hands icon, but you can use the Q&A box. You can also ask panelists questions this way as well, and we already have one question. So I'm going to go over some technical tips again on how to use the Q&A box. Look for the icon on the bottom of the Zoom screen. You don't have to give your name when you ask a question. You can choose anonymous. And after discussion with our panelists today, I'm not going to share anybody's name when I read out the questions. And again, you can use the Q&A box to network, collaborate, share emails, resources, and links, put whatever you want to share with the other members of the audience into the Q&A, and we will pass them on after the webinar. You can also ask the panelists questions using the Q&A box, or you can reach tech support. If you see somebody's already made your comment or asked your question or told a similar story, and you don't want to add to it, you can upvote. So Sherry, if you can put all of us on the screen, or if everybody can unmute and start your video, we can start the discussion. So the first question we have, I'll read it out. In the UK, and I suspect worldwide, those fighting for assisted suicide legislation often lump disabled people who oppose this in with pro-life Christian protesters. It's easier for them to dismiss us by saying we're pro-lifers, which many of us are not, than it is for them to acknowledge that we are disabled people with real concerns. Do you have any experience of dealing with this? So first I'll ask the panelists, and then we'll ask members of the audience if they have an answer. Anybody want to go for this? Diane, yes?
Yes, in the early days of the disability rights movement's interventions against assisted suicide, we had pro-life groups who did support us as a Canadian disability rights movement. And we saw that as, you know, obviously people are more than one-dimensional, right? They agreed that we shouldn't be killed as disabled people, but not all of us agreed that we were pro-life. And so we tried to stick to the main issue, which was killing of disabled people, right? And so that's how we dealt with it. Other people's definitions of things, again, is part of the ableism that we deal with all the time. And we all know all people don't think alike, right? So we can differentiate between different opinions at different times.
Anybody else on the panel have some remarks on that question?
MAiD is really important to understand. We don't all think and act the same way. I myself, if people want to choose medically assisted dying, that's fine. I object to being put at the front of the line to have special access simply because of my disability. I would much rather be given resources to live rather than speedy access to die. I mean, for me, disability rights and dignity does not mean getting in the fast lane to exit. Thank you.
Any comments, Gregor?
I mean, it's often, I mean, a strategy, right? You clump them together with something, right? I mean, to negate, I mean, the validity of what one says, right? And it's used for disabled people on all kinds of topics. That's not just as a MAiD issue and pro-life, right? I mean, right? Even people saying, oh, but I mean, you're not all thinking the same way, right? If you would use it with women's rights and saying not every woman is in favor of abortion and use it as an argument, you would get slaughtered, right? But with us, so, I mean, it's constantly this, what I call animal farm philosophy, right? It's really this double standard. It's this, I mean, some are more equal than others, and they use all the time stuff with us. If you would use the same sentence of reasoning and put another social group in there, I mean, people would, I mean, blow up. And with us is then seen totally acceptable. I mean, that's, I mean, a standard strategy, right, of double standard. That's why I put in my slide at the bottom, right, the bias-free framework. I mean, you can really unmask a lot of things with some basic, I mean, analytical questions.
It amazes me still how many people do not understand that access to programs and services. And I don't include quick access to MAiD among them, that access to programs, services, and facilities is not seen as a human rights or social justice issue as it's applied to disabled people. The defect, weakness, suffering element that has been applied to disability for centuries is still lurking just below the surface, like I said before, despite decades of advocacy from the disability constituency, because there's still this need to dismiss what disabled people have to say because we're seen as less than or not equal to, despite all the rhetoric around EDI, we still seem to fall off that continuum.
Yeah, right. I mean, even the very term accommodation, right? It's all very much ability privilege, right? I mean, if I have a wheelchair washroom, they call me, I'm getting accommodated. But of course, the washroom is an accommodation for the human body, period. Right? Otherwise, it would smell quite differently in any workplace, right? So, I mean, or saying confined to the wheelchair. Well, I mean, I can actually get out of my wheelchair, but I mean, the normal human race is confined to their legs, right? Or if you call me mobility impaired, well, the human race can't fly, so you're flying impaired. I mean, there is I could give a talk just on these kind of double standards of how you use, and it's based on ability privilege. You take certain things for granted that you're getting accommodated. You don't have to use the term. And I have to use the term and I have to be grateful. That's why I think it's a problem with medicalizing students in order to get accommodated at university level. I mean, yeah, I stop here otherwise. But there are so many systemic issues and which we haven't solved with, and I come then with all this new stuff, right? And then of course you have no one to do that, right? Because the old stuff hasn't even been solved. The employment numbers haven't improved in 100 years roughly, when you look at numbers, right? For deaf and blind, for example. Right, 85% of people who are under neurodiverse label are unemployed or don't work, right? And so on.
Thanks very much, Gregor. You're making some great points. We have 10 questions now from the audience, or 10 comments, and I just thought of something to respond to yours as well. Families have been accommodated, well, most mothers starting in the 1980s, a lot. Family work-life balance, that's one thing you were talking about, and yet those aren't called accommodations when you're allowed to leave work early because your child is, you have a medical appointment with your child, you have to go to the school play. These are not called accommodations, but they are for a different reason. They're not for disability reasons, they're for family reasons. So we've got a response from Christina, who's responding to the same question that I read out. She says, sorry, shouldn't have mentioned your name. I wrote an article on my blog about disability and reproductive rights on my activist blog. Some of it could be helpful when combating the claim that we are all pro-lifers. And I'll read out the web link just in case you want to put it in your search engines right now. www.onceandfuturecripple.com/en/disabled-people-aren't without the hyphen -a reason-to-ban abortions. So we'll also include this in the list of links that we'll send out after the webinar. So moving on to the next comment from an audience member. In 1996, under the leadership of Diane Coleman, I joined Not Dead Yet and wrote our theme song. At 73, I am 45 years past a spinal cord injury, when I was literally stabbed in the back. In 1987, I joined ADAPT, which stands for American Disabled for Accessible Public Transportation, which became American Disabled for Attendant Programs. Today, after the ADA, which is Americans with Disabilities Act, I believe, was passed. I can read out your email address. Is that okay, Gregor? Just thinking of your concerns about confidentiality. Maybe I'll include it. We'll include it in the message that the file that we send out after the webinar. That's probably better to keep everybody safe. And the person ends by saying, truly, we are in this together, in capital letters. So thanks very much for that comment and contribution. Again, anybody who wants to, oh, we've got 2 more questions. Good, 2 more comments, so I'll keep going. And this is a question for any of the panelists. A simple question. Is it possible for a person with a disability to autonomously choose of their own free will to avail themselves of medical assistance in dying? Or does the social model of disability preclude the autonomy of the individual in making choices about the end of one's life? Maybe I'll direct that question to Nancy, since that was part of your presentation. Do you want to start, Nancy?
Sure. I would say whatever a person chooses to do is their own business. But I don't think that a person should be forced into that situation because of untenable living conditions of poverty, lack of service provision, lack of options as far as transportation, employment, all of those things. Having a unequal distribution of options often makes people feel like they have no choice, because there are so many barriers to making those other choices. That being said, I would never get in the way of somebody who really wanted to take their own life. That's all about personal autonomy. But one shouldn't be driven to personal autonomy because they live in poverty, because they don't have access to goods and services that they need to live their lives the way they want to.
Any other comments from the panel? Thanks, Nancy.
I don't think it has anything with the social model of disability. I think that term is thrown around too much. That term simply means that the disablement originates with the social structure, nothing else. That by itself says nothing about whether you kill yourself or not, right? But I mean, what it does is that it can question that, I mean, you focus on disabled people as a group. And when you look, actually, we are, I mean, that's why I had the thalidomide one up there, right? You use a certain negative image, but what you have in mind goes far beyond. And indeed, that's what changed the abortion debate, according to Peter Singer and others. And we are used, right? Because reality is, when you look at Netherlands and Belgium, the push is really to allow for you're tired of life, to move beyond, right? Because, I mean, it started with something, you know, the public is right, I mean, right, can see that the same as we did that with genetic testing, and then you moved on and on and on, and you do the same thing there. So I think that has nothing to do with the social model of disability, and it also has nothing to do with autonomy, because if the term autonomy is really so important, then it should not be used in this selective way as it suits, I mean, right? Right? I mean, certain groups.
Did you want to say something, Diane?
I'm thinking about the social model, and I think that it actually pertains to the situation we're at in Canada. Because of the social barriers around housing, attitudes, treatment options, cost cutting, these are social issues that are barriers for people with disabilities to make real choices, right? Make a real choice. If you are suffering really because you have horrible housing that is mouse infested and has no locks on the doors, how can you make a choice? So the social model affects this decision. That's kind of how I see it. Ideally, the social model for the disability rights movement means this is our This is our vision. If all barriers are taken down, then we can participate on an equal basis with everyone else. But those barriers have just been coming up, even as MAiD has expanded in who can have MAiD.
Thanks, Diane. I've got some numbers here on employment from Stats Canada. In 2021, people with a disability had an employment rate of 19.1%, so 19%. In contrast, people with no disabilities, 63.7 or 64% reported being employed. So you can see there's a huge gap in employment there between people with disabilities and non-disabled people. So I'm going to move on to another question. The UK is polarized because of the actions of Humanists UK. So do we need to differentiate ourselves as disabled people from the reactionary religious right? Does anyone on the panel want to respond?
There's always going to be differences of opinion, and it's not about muzzling any particular group. It's about giving people a platform to speak from in the first place, to get their and to let their concerns be heard and known, and not diminished or made invisible because of a lack of access to make their concerns known. I think that we have had a very very simplistic understanding of what's involved with this issue, and it's not simple or simplistic, I think, and that's the problem with the way this legislation has been dealt with from the beginning. There are a lot of complexities here, very few of them having to do with access to dying. What we have to look at is access to resources for living, but we and other people have the right to make their opinions known, but there shouldn't be an exclusivity attached to any sort of opinion.
You got your hand up, Gregor?
I think in general, if you want to put forward the disability rights angle, I mean, you have to, I mean, really put very clear, I mean, and resist any objectification that others use you for their purposes. And this is not just the ritualist right. I mean, to just single them out as if they're the only ones, I mean, who are, I mean, using us. There are many groups who use our images and how we are, right, and so on, to sell their own stuff, right? And so as a disability rights group, I mean, simply one has to resist being objectified, period.
Are you waving your hand, Nancy?
Yeah. I think there's been a very colonial approach to the disabled body for a long time, and it's yes, we'll let you in, but we'll let you in on our terms and only in a very narrow perspective. There's really, to move on from what Gregor has said, there's really very little understanding of the barriers that disabled people encounter and the chronic systemic ableism that we deal with on a daily basis. As Gregor also alluded to, the right to peace shouldn't be some exciting thing. Non-disabled people do it every day, but when disabled people have been given a ramp and a toilet, that seems to be, somewhat exceptional. And that same exceptionality is sort of shown when disabled people actually show up, because we're not expected to be in most of the spaces and places we find ourselves daily. So we're chronically having to make the case to be there in the first place. And MAiD is just the latest iteration, sort of expediting why we shouldn't be there.
Thanks. Oh, Diane? Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what both Gregor and Nancy are saying. You know, the reason for a disability rights movement in the beginning, 40 years ago now, starting, is that others spoke for us. Others who considered themselves experts in our lives, doctors, social workers, parents, other family members. That's why we had to start a voice of our own, and that is the motto of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, as well as the Disabled Peoples International, are an international coalition in over 100 countries of disabled people's groups. This is continuous. We have to constantly reinforce that this is our voice, and a voice of persons with disabilities is different than just one disabled person's voice. We have to also understand that. A lot of people have said to me, well, there are people with disabilities who wish to have MAiD. So disabled people aren't all against it. No, we aren't all against it. However, our voice, a larger group that includes thousands of people who belong to our movement, have seen that this is a slippery slope. As we predicted, we start with end of life, and then, oops, quickly it becomes you're suffering too much as a disabled person. So yeah, as a movement, we have to continually differentiate ourselves from all other voices, especially those of service providers, right? Which is a fight we had 40 years ago, and we still have that, because who are the experts on the mental health panel? Psychiatrists, and I heard there were two people with lived experience of mental health disabilities, and one of them resigned because the experts who outnumbered people with that disability weren't listening. And so this is very problematic. Even when you have a seat at the table, how many seats do you have, right? This is a big issue.
Thanks, Diane. I just want to check in with Diane and Nancy. It's now 3:18. Did you want to leave at 3:30, or the 3:18 my time? Or can you hang on for the full 2 hours?
We can hang on, it's fine. Or
Okay.
I won't speak for Diane. I can hang on.
Hey,
Diane's
good.
giving a thumbs up, so.
Good. But we've got 14 questions, and I want to make sure I get to the ones that don't ask for the panel's opinion, so people get heard. The next question is, thank you for your session today. I work for a disability organization and I'm a DST student at TMU. I think that stands for Disability Studies Student at Toronto Metropolitan University. Can you speak to the current pause in extending MAiD to people with, quote, mental illness, unquote, and any changes that may occur, or will the Fed still push it through as is? Certainly gives us a window for ramping up action. Okay, that sounds like a question for the panelists and also for Trudeau, so maybe we'll pass that on to him when we're done. Any of the panelists want to answer that question? You want me to read it again? Oh, you've got the Q&A up on your screens, I guess.
I would just reiterate what I had just said. Even when we do have representatives, people aren't listening on the issue of this issue. It seems that, from what I'm seeing, is that the folks who want to have MAiD, are just ignoring other voices that are more vulnerable than theirs in many cases. And I'm not saying about people with disabilities, but people who are able-bodied cannot think of having pain and disability. They'd rather die. They really would rather be dead. I've had people say that to me. And I've also had people say to me, boy, I could never live like you with constant pain and fatigue. Oh, I don't know how you do it. I never would do it. And so, yeah, the question is, how do we get around this ableism? This is really where I think it has come to. we are so ableist in our society that we ignore these disabled people's voices. We're just ignoring them.
Well, if we don't agree with the status quo, and I mean of the majority status quo, then we're routinely discounted as some kind of extremist who likes to overblow the, you know, there's this constant trust us approach to legislation related to disability, and there's I have a problem trusting people who are inherently uncomfortable with the way I live my life. When I was out and about in the world of non-disabled people more than I am now, I would be routinely approached by individuals who couldn't understand why I was happy and how could I be happy in my particular situation. And they would routinely tell me that they couldn't live the way I do. And I thought to myself, then you really don't know the way I live. You know, there's very little creativity when it comes to the way humans think, move, and perceive the world. You know, I think diversity is the spice of life. We just have to make people understand that disability is a lot sexier than a lot of people think it is, right? But then anybody that's been marginalized for whatever reason, and it's important to recognize that can be numerous marginalities working at the same time, have also been subjected to this kind of lack of progressive thinking throughout centuries. We're just, this is the latest iteration, and unfortunately it's 2023. You'd think we could get beyond this by now.
Thanks, Nancy. You sparked an idea in me, or a reaction. When somebody makes those extraordinarily rude comments about the quality of your life, all they've seen is you in maybe a couple of minutes. They have no clue what the rest of your life looks like. In the case of people with invisible chronic illnesses, for example, like Diane and I have, people don't see anything. So they often deny, you can't be sick. There's nothing wrong with you. You don't look disabled. So there's two sides to that coin. People making assumptions based on a very short moment of seeing you, making assumptions about the rest of your life. And then people also, because they can't see what the problem is, not believing you. So maybe we better move on. We've got, another one came in. This is someone who writes that this is more of a comment rather than a question. That's great. Every comment's welcome. I am a disabled person who is also a great supporter of death positivity. I desperately want to see MDs removed from the MAiD process, as they are usually among our greatest abusers and gatekeepers, especially for disabled people with multiple marginalized identities. What I want to see is licensing of holistic dying care specialists from outside the medical system who can work with people who are seeking MAiD to help them with their decision to end their lives without giving even more undeserved power to MDs and the biomedical system. This comment had 4 upvotes. So there's 3 other people who agree with this comment. Does anybody want to give a response on the panel? It's got 5 upvotes.
I mean, there are many studies which show the difference, in perception between medical profession and, and disabled people. Studies going right from the 90s and even earlier. This is constant. The difference in perception is just, is just there. And reality is, look at this thalidomide quote. If this is what you're exposed to throughout your life, if this is a premise, I can't even blame people, right? If this is what it is, you are only, you're a product of your own, right, what you're exposed to. And if this is what the narrative is, right? Where would you get something from it? Like, I mean, oh, this is totally not right. Short of that, you are yourself then, or, I mean, we have with women rights, we have a term like called nicht, I mean, you internalize your oppression, right? That is the same. If you're exposed constantly about yourself, that, I mean, you're worthless and that your life is not worthy, and you have all this systemic disableism, it's very easy then to, I mean, internalize oppression also to yourself. The same as we do use that term for women. It's interesting, we use very little that term in relation to disabled people. But so it's just as applicable.
Thanks, Gregor. Oh, Diane, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's why I think we have to get at the issue of ableism. It's insidious in society. I myself am ableist every day to myself. I get up in the morning and think, oh, how much am I going to get done today? I want to do more. Why can't I do more? And then I go, oh, there is that ableist tape running in my head about more and faster and better. And hey, I know that tape doesn't work for me. So I have to get myself readjusted for the day. And this tape is going on in everybody's head, and it has nothing to do with whether you're a progressive person or not. Some people feel quite offended because they said, I'm doing my best to be an ally, and now you're criticizing me because they see themselves as a progressive person. And yes, you are, but you know what? All of us are ableist. It's like all of us are racist in our society because we have grown up that way. So we have to get at dismantling this system of thinking as well.
Yeah, we have to stop tinkering around the edges, right? There's been no real dismantling of the insidious, endemic, systemic ableism that we have to deal with all the time. And that's the part that's tiring, is that we have to deal with these micro oppressive kind of things. There's as Diane alluded to, and Gregor earlier, there's this kind of aversive ableism that we have to deal with. Some of my best, some of my best friends are disabled people. What do you mean? I'm incredibly, what we have to deal with is the social yuck factor and how people often project their levels of discomfort onto us, right? So they have to get comfortable with disability and disabled people. We're not going anywhere, and you're around us every day anyway. You just might not realize it. So I think we just, as a society, we need to have more real concrete education as to what's actually happening here, and that we can't put lipstick on a pig. We have to do some real serious work here. And maybe there are some difficult conversations ahead, but I say bring them on.
Thanks, Nancy. I'll get back to comments and questions and ideas from the audience. One person writes, disability justice is interracial, multicultural, intergenerational, gender fluid, with cross-disability solidarity. Have you moved towards disability justice? Any comments? I think you talked about racism, Diane.
We're on a path towards disability justice in our disability rights movement in Canada. In fact, I know, for instance, that Disabled Women's Network of Canada, our national disabled women's group, has been looking at intersectionality for the last 10 years in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and including those folks in our work. One of the criticisms, of course, of the disability rights movement from 40 years ago is that the primary actors were white men in wheelchairs, in Canada and in other Western countries. And that is true. They were people who were in a position, they had more power at that time because they were men and they were white, and they were able to push the agenda forward. Now, of course, we have to include everyone. And we can't just have the white disability rights movement of mobility impaired people. I know as a person with invisible disabilities, you know, there has been the issue of visible versus invisible disabilities within the disability rights movement too. And some feelings that, well, those, you know, from some, that these invisible disabilities are not really disabilities, not like we experience as those who have visible disabilities. And so there has been a bit of tension, but I think that has mostly resolved. Now we have to, and of course the tension around the participation of women, because men were very much in leadership in the early years. And, you know, that's why Disabled Women's Network Canada was founded in 1986, because there was not a forum for women to speak within the larger movement. The men wanted to sit down and speak on the women's issues with them. And this is what forced the creation of a separate group, and they work in coalition with other disability groups as well.
Thanks, Diane. I want to move on to make sure we cover everybody's contributions from the audience. Here's another one. How do you think MAiD will or has created barriers for deinstitutionalizing long-term care, which often houses disabled folks as well as older adults, who I might add often are all in long-term care because they have something that impairs them, often dementia. Nancy?
This doesn't exactly touch on it, but the government reports relating to MAiD make a focus on the idea what a cost-saving measure medical assistance in dying is, right? So how do you cut costs of institutionalization and deinstitutionalization? Remove the issue from the beginning. But and I found it really deplorable. That was the big thing that the latest government reports on MAiD were focusing on, was the cost effectiveness and how much money that MAiD was saving people. But again, this is a very narrow approach to what cost effectiveness really is.
I could add something there. I read a report that Nancy, I think you forwarded. It was embedded in a blog. It was the Senate, it was parliamentary, it was a part of the Parliament of Canada. A senator asked the economic analyst to calculate the cost savings with MAiD, or the cost. The senator actually asked for the cost of MAiD, and the analyst found out that it was going to save money for mostly the provincial governments, who are responsible for healthcare budgets, or most of them, but it wasn't a large amount. It was only $2 billion, I think, out of budgets that are way bigger than that. And it was a small percentage of costs. So the people who are citing this report might want to look back, may not have read it, or they're using another report. But the conclusion of the senator of the Parliament of Canada researchers was that it'll save money for the provinces, but not a lot. So just an update on that one. I'm someone who looks at deinstitutionalizing long-term care, using the lessons that come from deinstitutionalizing younger people. And I think it could be a barrier, because what's coming up, and what I've heard physicians advocate and organizations that call it, for example, Dying with Dignity advocate, is before you lose your capacity when you have advanced dementia, ask for MAiD in advance before you get to that stage. So this is an attempt to avoid long-term care. In some cases, one of the media articles that I found when I compiled the in memoriam slide was a woman who didn't want to go into long-term care. She had early onset dementia, and she didn't want to live the life that she envisioned for herself going into long-term care, because that's what we offer people in Canada, people with dementia. We don't offer community-based supportive housing. We don't offer attendant support the way we do with younger people, not available to older people with dementia. And so this solution that's seen right now is you go into an institution, which is a nursing home, and a lot of people aren't aware of conditions in nursing homes because they haven't spent time there. And we're not really paying attention to this issue, which affects people with disabilities as well, people living with dementia and frailties and heart conditions and so on that lead them to be in an institution. We're also cutting home care. In Ontario, in Canada, we spend way less on home care than countries in Europe do. United States and Canada are one of the two countries in the OECD who spend a very low proportion on home care and other supports for people with disabilities that might end up in long-term care, including, of course, now younger people who can't get the attendant care that they need and can't get into community supportive housing because there's not enough of it. And it's been cut, it doesn't meet demand. And so people end up having to live in long-term care, which is an institution that the whole idea of deinstitutionalization was created to avoid. So there's some more comments. Maybe we should move on to the next audience contribution. I'm looking for the upvotes to see whose questions have been asked more than once. Thank you for putting together this excellent panel and for sharing your insights. Do you think radically expanding MAiD to all humans, regardless of their situation, for example, to the non-disabled as well, would get around the discrimination currently embedded in these policies or make them worse? Any comments, panelists?
I don't know why people are so keen to exit. I would much rather see people have resources to live to the fullest, higher wages, for example, affordable housing, food that people can actually afford to buy, basic stuff like that, rather than having wholesale exit policy. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Nancy. Well, we've got more questions coming in and more comments. So I think I'm going to go to the most recent one. How best can you lobby government as an ally to all of you? Here's an action idea. Anybody on the panel have any thoughts? Gregory?
I don't think there's an easy answer. Let's obviously look at our advancements over the decades. Right? I mean, independent of MAiD, I mean, we have to deal on so many topics with governments, and it really changes. Next one comes in and you're starting at zero again. Right? And the flavor of the month, who is in, who is out, what do we cover? I mean, there's no consistency. I mean, right, otherwise we would have solved. I mean, we know what it takes to employ disabled people. It's not like we don't even have knowledge. It's really an implementation issue. We know how a building should look like, and so on. And we still build new buildings who are not accessible, right? Because the building code in the way it's written is watered down so much that it's actually not accessible, and so on. It's very hard, and it's not one government. I mean, because it changes, and then, I mean, do you deal with the middle management, and how much do you get really to the top, and to the top, right? if it changes every 4 years or so, or in between even, you're starting all over again because the literacy is just not there. The political will depends on so many, different factors. There is no easy answer or strategy, I think.
Thanks, Gregor. I think we should move along. It's now 3:41 in Toronto, where I am. So we've got 20 minutes left or so. Yeah, Diane?
Just briefly, I think the only way to get at this issue right now is through the courts. What I think needs to happen is that a court challenge needs to be made to the current MAiD legislation phase 2. And I have heard rumors that there are folks who are preparing that. I think that within our system, as Gregor was saying, yeah, our governments change. I think the only way that we can fight back now is through the courts, because we also had people at the parliamentary hearings on MAiD, disabled people from our organizations, and they felt very much discounted and heckled by members of parliament who weren't taking them seriously.
Thanks, Diane. Here's a comment that's got, I just lost it. I'm just going to look at it. Here we go. That's got 6 upvotes. So it's a common issue for people. Comment: isn't every life inherently, quote, equal, unequal? I am Black and the parent of an adult son born in 1982 with Down syndrome. The geneticist who confirmed his diagnosis reminded us as parents that our son inherited all of our genetics. Doctors told us our son would not walk, talk, ride a bike, or throw a ball. He walked within the, quote, norm, began expressive language quite early, excelled in EQ, not sure what that means, and was fully toilet trained by 3, and is now employed as a self-advocate, has started his own DJ business. It breaks my heart to know he and others are considered discardable. When we all believe in saving all lives and decide to work as one body to this end, things will never change for any of us. Let's join forces and honor all life without exception. Well said. So I'm just looking for the next popular comment. Here's one. I am a social work student working towards my BSW at the University of Manitoba. I appreciate this panel and your time and opinion. My question is, what would you need and like to see from emerging social workers in this profession? So what can social workers do about our issue of today? Diane?
Yes, I think in general, social workers need to listen to people with disabilities. And that has been an issue between social workers and people with disabilities for many years, and still is for some people whose services are worked out with social workers, and the social worker has control over the gate, whether they get it or not, right? So I think the most important thing is listen to the people with lived experience. And I don't know if social work does talk about disability and disability rights or not at University of Manitoba, but we encourage social work students to take an elective with us in disability studies at University of Manitoba. We can then unpack models and have a real good look at what the role of social workers and experts have been. We don't want to just say, oh, all of you are bad. We need to work with you. You have access to resources. You have access to credibility, right? And we need you to work with us. That is the most important thing to remember.
Nancy, can you give Nancy and Gregor want to speak. I'm just noticing we've got 15 minutes left and lots of questions to go. So
Sure, I'll make this really quick. Well-informed allies are priceless.
That's very brief, very quick. Here's our next question in popularity terms. Is the topic of killing people with disabilities really solely a disability rights question? Isn't there room for the larger question of creating a society in which it is easier for us to care for one another, especially when we are vulnerable? MAiD has no place in such a society, whether people want it or not. So I'll just leave that. It doesn't ask for an answer. I'd just like to make sure that all the questions get and the comments get on our recording.
I think Gregor wanted to say something.
Okay, Gregor.
Of the social work. I think they have to, I mean, one has to really audit the curriculum and the material. A lot of them is still very medicalized. I mean, there's a reason why in many universities, the mainstream is clinical social work, which comes from a totally different premise than the community building social work, right? So even in which stream you will get totally different content very likely. And I mean, social work has, like occupational therapy, they have beautiful language, right? When you really look at it, they're beautiful social justice language. Even occupational therapy talks about occupational rights, occupational oppression, occupational apartheid. Beautiful language, but the language never makes it to actually in the implementation. There seems to be something lost in translation, right? I mean, they don't apply the language they have for disabled people. And they wouldn't, I mean, it's just, I mean, so, and a lot of issues around impact on the social of marginalized groups, social work just doesn't teach it, like science and technology. I mean, so the curriculum is simply not up to snuff on the new things. Eco-social work does not cover disabled people within environmental activism and impact of, right, environmental demands and environmental activism. Right, so the field has to modernize and really, I mean, right, de-disabilize or whatever you want to call these terms, right? I mean, around disabled people away from the medical lens.
Thanks, Gregor. We still have 20 questions to go. Is everybody on the panel willing to stay a bit longer, and including Sherry?
I have to go to another one. I'm already 40 minutes, I mean, into that where I have to other one I have to go. So I have to see the second half.
So maybe what I'll do is read out the comments, and then I want to get them all on the recording at least, and there'll be things for people to think about. So here's another one. I'm appalled that in the Truchon decision, according to Dr. Lemons, that our concerns were dismissed by lawyers as, quote, value laden. How can our disability justice concerns be truly heard when in a legal setting, unbelievably, they are dismissed so effectively? I think that the general public is ignorant of our concerns and subscribes to deeply ableist assumptions about life with disability, so the politicians just support the status quo. I think you probably all agree with that, panelists. So let's make sure everybody gets heard. I want to make sure that everybody gets heard and has their question read out. Disability justice is also anti-capitalist. Ableism is one of the foundational pillars of capitalism. Great comment. I have a comment on how to mirror our situation with able-bodied people. That's a great, I think it may be a question, so we'll hang on to that for a bit so we get through the comments. How are we training psychologists and counselors to work with people with disabilities to find value in life versus choosing MAiD? I have counseled a few people who have moved from MAiD to living. I am a therapist with a disability and am mentored by a British disability rights activist. Let's see how we're doing. No, hold that one, since that's a question. Here's another comment. It seems that gatekeeping resources herds the, quote, difficult to think of, unquote, and the, quote, too expensive, unquote, toward death as a logical option. When those gatekeepers then find themselves on the wrong side of these categories, I wonder how their ideas would change. Great point, great point. Next one. Comment from Joe Massarelli from Massachusetts. Devaluation is real. People with disabilities have had and do experience gross and grievous disregard of their rights and autonomy by society. Having said this, MAiD and other death-dealing policies use personal autonomy and choice making as a major go-to argument. Whenever we defend the quote right of anyone to kill themselves, we enter the idiom of the enemy. Another great point. For the panel, so we'll keep this question for later. How are we training psychologists and counselors to work with people with disabilities to find value in life versus choosing MAiD? Oh, sorry, I've already read that one. Let's see. Besides ableism, do you recognize the toxic effects of disability phobia? Good new word, which is like homophobia. Non-disabled, that is not yet disabled, are prepared to kill those they are afraid of or allow them to die. Another excellent point. Canada also brags about organ donation as a benefit of MAiD. Great point. I think that might be in Trudeau's presentation. Thank you for your comments. My master's thesis is looking at deinstitutionalizing and perhaps the abolition of long-term care. So that is very helpful. I'm very glad to hear that. That's my one of my activist and research activities as well. Here's a comment. Dying with Dignity Canada is focusing on making sure advanced requests are approved in Parliament on or by June 15th of this year. Every cent disability Dying with Dignity Canada has collected recently is being used on a yet unknown flurry of marketing to get advanced requests approved. That's very good information. Thank you for telling us that. Full disclosure, I am a Roman Catholic pro-lifer. The Canadian Association of MAiD Assessors is not objective in that its members are pro-MAiD to begin with. Like-minded colleagues sign off as the second MD or NP, nurse practitioner, often without seeing or even speaking to the applicant. As a pro-lifer whose driving principle is that every life is valuable, worthy of respect and protection, it seems to me we are not at all at odds with disabled advocacy groups. Excellent conference. Thank you very much. Let's see who else. Oh, we still got lots. One person comments, defend, develop, decolonize. Great points. Another one says with 3 upvotes, EQ equals emotional intelligence, also known as emotional quotient. Thank you for that point. Here's one that's been upvoted 4 times. I live in the US. The discussion around cost, quote, savings as an argument, in my opinion, really unmasks the underlying valuation of life with a disability. In my experience of advocacy with legislators on services for people with disabilities, we are in constantly needing to explain that what is viewed as savings is actually just postponing cost, frequently imposing more suffering and pain along the way. Thank you very much for that comment. I just, okay. Oh, that was goodbye, Gregor. I wasn't reading the chat to catch up with it. Thank you very much, Gregor. There's someone we've heard from before. Arch Disability Law and a consortium of others have launched a challenge with the UN under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Interested folks can watch this excellent webinar about how the expansion of MAiD only applies to disabled people in Canada, a really important point. And then the person gives the how to reach this information that she's referring to. Let's see what we've got. Oh, that's a question. I'm trying to run through all the comments. Too many social workers divide folks into the keepers and the kept, the do-gooders and the done-to. Grassroots organizers align with the kept and done-to, seeking disability justice, creative access, freedom, empowerment. Thanks very much. Another person writes, I happily use the research of Dr. Hansen and Dr. Dreger in my social work classes. I hear your point, Dr. Baldwin. We'll pass that on to Gregor. Sadly, Iceland claims to have wiped out, in quotes, Down syndrome. Where is the outcry? Very good point, and Nancy, you sent a very good video on the subject. So now I'm going to go back to the top. 4 minutes left. Or maybe we can we go a little longer? Is that okay with Sherry and Diane? No, not for Nancy. Okay. So how are we training psychologists and counselors to work with people with disabilities to find value in life versus choosing MAiD? I've counseled a few people who have moved from MAiD to living. I'm a therapist with a disability, and I'm mentored by a British disability rights activist. Anybody want to answer that quickly, Diane?
Yeah, I think the answer is in the question. The asker here was mentored by someone in the disability rights movement to see the value of disability and diversity around disability. And I would encourage people with disabilities to join organizations of people with disabilities, whether those be arts organizations or organizations that are looking to change legislation, or even peer counseling groups where folks can talk about how life is. The greatest, the greatest support is the person with disability who knows what it's like to live life with a disability. And I know for myself, I haven't always had a disability. I started out as a non-disabled ally 40 years ago. And then 10 years into working as an ally, I acquired disability. And the reason why I could see hope, see a life, was because I had incredible mentors within the worldwide disability rights movement who show how it's done, how we as humans can adapt, we are creative, and we can have good lives that are worth a lot. They are of value. People need to talk to other disabled people. It's great that you're counseling as a disabled person.
Great. We still have a few things to go, comments to go, but it's 2 minutes to the end of our webinar today. So some of the questions are administrative. The person you were just answering the question for, I will pass that on in what we send out after the webinar. So maybe Nancy, if you have any last 1 minute wrap up, and then I'll wrap up the webinar.
I just think it's great to have had this opportunity for the discussion, and hopefully this is the beginning and not the end. And just expect disability and understand that disability is cool.
Right on. Thanks very much for that, Nancy. Oops. So, this webinar far exceeded my hopes and expectations for organizing it. We had such wonderful input from the audience and lots of terrific discussion, and there's still